Section: The Masquerade at Belgravia. It was a particularly dreary January afternoon, the kind where the London fog seeps through every crack and window pane, muting even the sound of the distant hansoms clattering along Baker Street. Holmes, to no one's surprise, had taken to chemical experiments on the sitting-room table, an endeavor I had long since learned to endure with stoic patience and an open window. The scent of burnt pepper and sulfur clung to the curtains like an unwelcome guest. I had been reading through a recent monograph on battlefield surgery when Mrs. Hudson arrived, bearing a single letter atop a silver salver. She looked both curious and slightly perturbed. A most peculiar visitor. "Mr. Holmes," she announced, eyes lingering on the strange seal. "Wouldn't give a name. Just handed this over, said it was urgent, and vanished down the steps before I could so much as ask him whether he took sugar." Holmes looked up at once. Interesting. He took the envelope with a gloved hand, turning it over slowly. The seal was striking deep violet wax, pressed with the image of a raven perched upon a velvet theatrical mask. He sliced it open with the precision of a surgeon, his pale eyes scanning the contents. "Well?" I asked, lowering my book. "Is it another cryptic warning of global conspiracy, or merely someone seeking advice on missing spoons?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Neither. We are invited, my dear Watson, to a masquerade." "A masquerade?" I repeated. "Surely you jest." "Quite sincerely. Tomorrow evening. Wexley Crescent, Belgravia. No. 7, to be precise. A private affair. Hosted at the Marchioness of Davington's estate, yet, curiously, the invitation is not from her." He handed me the letter. The handwriting was unusual sharp, angular, and unwavering. The message was brief. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, your presence is requested tomorrow evening at No. 7, Wexley Crescent, Belgravia. Come in costume, no weapons. There is a secret behind the velvet mask." The sixth read it twice. "No weapons?" I asked, unsettled. "That seems an ominous restriction." "Quite," Holmes agreed, "though an understandable one if one expects deceit or danger among the guests. Whoever wrote this expects intrigue and perhaps confrontation. Still, an anonymous host, an exclusive guest list, and this symbolic seal, it positively reeks of a carefully constructed enigma." He stood and began pacing. "There's more at play here than mere society amusement. The use of the raven and mask together is no accident. The raven, long a symbol of watchfulness, death, or fate. The mask concealment, identity, theater. Together they suggest a performance, yes, but also a threat cloaked in ceremony." I frowned. "And you mean to walk straight into it?" With open eyes, Holmes said, a glint of excitement in his gaze. "Come, Watson will need costumes. Something that allows us both visibility and maneuverability. There's a delightful costumier on Brewer Street. We must be inventive. Something subtle but observant." By the following evening, the fog had thickened into a pale soup that hugged the lamp-lit cobblestones. We arrived at Wexley Crescent just before 9 o'clock, dressed in our chosen disguises. Holmes, always one to revel in dramatic flair, had selected the garb of a Venetian. Nobleman deep plum velvet, silver filigree across the mask, and a tricorn hat tilted rakishly over one eye. I somewhat less enthusiastically had agreed to wear the robes of a medieval plague doctor, complete with a long-beaked mask that was, I dare say, more sinister than dignified. The Marchioness's townhouse was a marvel tall and symmetrical, framed by ivy-wrapped columns and softly glowing gas lamps. From within came the swell of chamber music, laughter, and the faintest tinkle of glasses. We presented our invitation at the door, where a masked footman inspected it, bowed, and ushered. "Use inside." The entrance hall glittered with candlelight. Crystal chandeliers hung above us like inverted bouquets of starlight. Guests of every ilk and station milled through the marbled corridors, dressed in costumes ranging from Grecian deities to Napoleonic officers. Masks obscured every face, turning even familiar acquaintances into strangers. "I feel as though we've stepped into one of Poe's nightmares," I murmured, peering around the room. Holmes nodded, which makes it all the more imperative to remain alert. Look not at the costumes, but the posture, the gait, the hands. They reveal far more than painted masks. We strolled past a trio of masked debutantes gossiping behind feathered fans, and then by a rotund man dressed as King Henry VIII, who was deep in debate with a pharaoh. The air smelled of rose water, champagne, and something metallic beneath it all, a tension that prickled at the back of the neck. "Observe Holmes," said softly, pointing with his cane. "The Marquis of Ipswich, dressed as a Roman senator, has been watching the main stairway for 10 minutes. See the way he fiddles with his ring? Nervous habit. And that woman with the swan mask? She's made 3 rotations of the room, but hasn't spoken to a single guest." "She looks uneasy," I agreed. "Not uneasy calculating. She's searching for someone." Before I could respond, the music ceased. 3 resonant chimes rang out from the ballroom. All conversation halted. At the top of the staircase stood a singular figure neither announced nor acknowledged. Clad in flowing black velvet, they wore a mask so seamless and dark it seemed to drink in the candlelight. Its smooth surface betrayed no features, no mouth, no eyes, yet it exuded an unsettling magnetism. The figure stood motionless for several seconds, commanding the attention of every soul present. Then, without a word, they descended. Each step was deliberate. The hush in the hall was palpable. As the figure reached the bottom, they produced a silver envelope from within their cloak and handed it to the butler. With practiced grace, they turned and vanished back up the stairs, the velvet cloak flowing behind them like a living shadow. Murmurs erupted as soon as they were gone. The butler, confused but composed, opened the envelope and looked about. Holmes stepped forward. "I believe that is for me," he said calmly. The butler, startled, glanced at the card and handed it over. Holmes read it silently, then passed it to me. The same sharp handwriting. The one behind the mask has already struck once. They will again. But only you, Mr. Holmes, can see what lies beneath the velvet. "Volt, this is no party," I said, heart beginning to race. "This is a trap." "Perhaps," Holmes said, "or a challenge. But one thing is certain. There's a crime buried somewhere in all this theater." He pocketed the note and turned toward the ballroom. "Come, Watson. Let you circulate. Masks or no, someone in this room holds the answer, and I intend to uncover it before the next chime rings." Section: A Seance and a Shadow the Next morning. The fog returned to Baker Street with renewed conviction, drawing a cold curtain across the windows of our sitting room. I found Holmes where I had left him the previous evening still. At the mantelpiece The crimson velvet mask laid delicately beside him atop a copy of the Times. He had neither eaten nor slept. "You'll ruin your eyes with that scowl, Holmes," I said, offering him a cup of tea. "You've been awake all night, haven't you?" He accepted the cup with a nod of thanks, his gaze never shifting from the mask. "Watson," he said, "observe this. Silk. Feel the grain. Look at the stitching." I obliged, holding the mask delicately in my hands. The fabric was of the finest quality, with meticulous hand stitching around the eye holes. On closer inspection, I saw a small embroidered emblem stitched inside the lining, almost imperceptible unless the mask was held to the light. "A crescent moon over a mask," I said aloud. "Indeed. The mark of a tailor in Paris known for designing garments for private theatrical societies. The emblem belongs to a now-defunct salon called La Société de Minuit." "A private theater company?" I asked, setting the mask down. "Of sorts. They specialized in masked performances of an esoteric nature dramas enacted in secrecy by invitation, only often for the wealthiest of Europe's elite. The company vanished from Paris nearly 5 years ago after a scandal involving a missing aristocrat and a forged will." "And you believe our velvet-masked visitor is connected to this troupe?" Holmes pressed his fingers together. "I suspect more than a connection. I suspect an identity." Just then, there came a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson admitted a visitor miss. Aveline Thorne had returned. She stepped into the room with an air of composed elegance, though it was clear she had not slept either. Her eyes were rimmed with fatigue, her gloves damp from the London mist. She carried a small envelope in one gloved hand. "I hope I do not intrude," she said. Holmes gestured to the seat opposite his own. "Not at all, Miss Thorne. In fact, we were just speaking of you." She did not sit. Instead, she placed the envelope on the table. "I received this last night, slipped under the door. I thought it best you see it." Holmes picked up the envelope with a pair of tweezers. It bore no markings, no address, no signature. He extracted the contents and unfolded the single sheet inside. It was a note, handwritten in sweeping black ink. "Beware the second mask. The truth lies not in mourning, but in memory. Meet me tonight, midnight, Red Hill Chapel." Holmes's eyes narrowed. Red Hill Chapel. That's 3 miles southeast in Lambeth. A derelict parish, condemned after the fire 10 years ago. "I've never been there," Miss Thorne said softly. "I don't understand any of this. What does it mean, the second mask? And what truth am I being warned of?" Holmes leaned forward. "Miss Thorne, forgive the intrusion, but I must. Ask again, why did you come to me and not the police?" She hesitated. "I suppose I feared I wouldn't be believed. There's been no crime, no theft, only strange occurrences. Whispers, vanishing letters, and now this mask. It all feels like theater." "Perhaps because it is theater," Holmes said. "But as with all theater, the players leave behind signs of the real beneath the costume. Tell me what happened to your mother." Miss Thorne froze. "She died 6 years ago," she said quietly, "in Paris, while visiting an old friend. It was sudden a fever. I was studying in England at the time." "And your father?" "Passed when I was a child." Holmes stood and walked to the window, watching the fog coil around the gas lamps beyond. "Forgive me, Miss Thorne, but I believe the truth of your past is somehow intertwined with the mask. and with whoever left this note. She lowered her gaze. There was something. My mother kept secrets. She traveled often and never explained why. She received strange letters, some in French, some in a language I didn't recognize. Holmes turned. Did she ever mention the name Société Diminuite? Miss Thorne's breath caught. Yes, she whispered. Once. I overheard her speaking it in a telephone conversation. I thought it was a poem or a book. Holmes exhaled through his nose. Watson, I believe the veil is beginning to lift. He crossed the room and opened a drawer from his desk, retrieving a folded map. He laid it out and circled a spot in red pencil. Red Hill Chapel is an ideal setting for a private rendezvous. Isolated, abandoned. But I do not believe this is a simple warning. Someone wishes to draw you there, Miss Thorne, and I intend to find out who. That night, Holmes and I prepared as we had for many a clandestine rendezvous. He dressed in dark grays, blending easily into shadow, and armed himself with a slender walking cane that concealed a blade one of his more subtle inventions. We arrived in Lambeth shortly before midnight. The chapel was an old Romanesque ruin, its bell tower leaning slightly toward the river like an old drunk resting on a crutch. Ivy smothered the walls, and broken gravestones jutted from the ground like cracked teeth. The chapel doors stood ajar. Inside. Pews lay in disarray, tattered. Altar cloth hung limp over a splintered pulpit. The air smelled of dust and stone and something else. Candle wax. Someone had been here recently. We moved carefully through the nave, our footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. Then, music. Soft. Faint. A violin, playing a single sustained note. Holmes held up a hand, signaling me to wait. He advanced silently toward the chancel. There, bathed in moonlight through the broken rose window, stood a tall figure in a crimson cloak. And a velvet mask. The same mask as before, or so I thought until Holmes stepped forward and the figure turned. This mask was not red, but violet. The second mask. Who are you? Holmes called. The figure raised a hand and pointed to the altar. There, laying upon the stone, was a leather-bound journal. Holmes advanced. The figure backed into the shadows and vanished. Without a sound, we reached the altar together. Holmes picked up the journal and turned the first page. It was written in French. He flipped through it, eyes widening. These are correspondences, he whispered, between a woman named Lucienne Thorne and the founder of the Société Diminuite, spanning years. He stopped on a sketch, a precise drawing of the velvet mask, annotated in spidery French. Lucienne Thorne, I said slowly. Your mother? Aveline, who had entered behind us, looked pale. Yes, Holmes shut the book gently. She was one of them, he said. Not merely a visitor to their theater. She was part of it. The mask, the letters, the cryptic warnings, all pointed to something far more personal than we had anticipated. Holmes turned to me, his voice low. This is no longer just a mystery of theft or performance. This is the unmasking of a past someone desperately wants to keep hidden. Section. The house on Rue Diminuite. The morning that followed our moonlit excursion to Red Hill Chapel brought with it a reluctant gray dawn. The fog had lifted, but London streets remained veiled in a chill that matched the disquiet in my heart. I found Holmes already at work when I returned from my early errands, poring over the leather-bound journal recovered from the chapel altar. Its pages spread before him like a crime scene waiting to be dissected. He looked up only briefly as I entered. "Watson," he said briskly, "have you ever studied the handwriting of French aristocracy during the Second Empire?" "I can't say I have. Pity. You'd find it revealing. Fluid, artistic, often with subtle flourishes that denote both status and vanity." He tapped the pages with a slim finger. "This journal was written by someone of high education and subtle skill. And this," he held up the page with the intricate velvet mask sketch, "was no idle doodle. It is a sigil." I peered over his shoulder. "A sigil?" "A symbol of allegiance," he replied. Lucienne Thorne, Aveline's mother, was not merely corresponding with the founder of La Société Diminuite. She was documenting rights, performances, names, locations. I believe we are staring into the pages of a clandestine ledger for a masked society that lived and performed in the margins of Europe's elite. I frowned. "You think it a cult?" Holmes shook his head. "A theater, but a theater with ambitions far beyond the stage. These entries speak of meetings in drawing rooms behind cathedrals, performances in the dead of night scenes so elaborate that entire identities were assumed and discarded." He closed the book gently. "Our next move, Watson, is Paris." I blinked. "Paris?" He turned toward the window. Lucienne Thorne died there. Her final letters were mailed from an address on the Rue de Minuit, an alley little known outside the theater district. If there are still players in this performance, we must find their stage. And so it was within 2 days that we found ourselves in Paris, our train winding its way from Calais under a brooding sky. Holmes remained silent for most of the journey, eyes flitting over the journal as though chasing invisible threads between the lines. I confess I dozed intermittently, awoken only by the occasional mutter from Holmes or the rattle of rails as we entered the city. Upon arriving at the Gare du Nord, we proceeded at once to the Rue de Minuit, a narrow, cobbled lane wedged between a shuttered perfumery and a row of boarded-up boarding houses in the shadow of Montmartre. The gas lamps here flickered uncertainly, and the entire street seemed forgotten by the city around it. "This is the address," Holmes said, stopping before a blackened wrought-iron gate. The number 42 was barely visible beneath years of soot and rain. The house beyond was a 3-story townhouse, its facade weather-worn and its windows draped in thick velvet curtains. A rusted plaque beside the door read simply, "Maison de Minuit." Holmes rapped smartly with his cane. No response. He knocked again. This time a movement curtains stirred. Moments later the door creaked open, revealing an elderly man in a crimson waistcoat and white gloves. He blinked at us owlishly. "We?" he asked. Holmes bowed slightly. "Monsieur Rousseau?" The man gave a slow nod. "We come regarding Lucienne Thorne." The name struck the man like a thrown stone. His composure wavered. "I do not speak of the dead," he said. Beginning to close the door, Holmes stopped it with a gloved hand. "She was your patron once, perhaps more." The man's expression darkened. "Who are you?" "Sherlock Holmes." "This is Dr. Watson." Rousseau hesitated. Then, with a sigh that seemed to deflate his entire frame, he opened the door fully. "Then come inside, messieurs. But you will not like what you find." The interior of the house was unlike any dwelling I'd seen. Heavy velvet lined the walls. Portraits of masked figures hung in oval frames, each anonymous, yet hauntingly expressive. Candelabras stood like sentinels in the hall, their waxy arms half melted. There was a hush in the air, as though a performance had ended only moments. Before our arrival, Rousseau led us to a drawing room cluttered with books and set pieces, a chaise lounge, an antique harp, a disused lantern projector. She was a visionary, he said at last, pouring 3 cups of dark tea. Lucian, she believed in theater as transcendence, that when masked, one could become truth rather than hide from it. Holmes nodded. And she founded La Société Diminuite? Not founded, Rousseau said. Resurrected? The society existed in secret during the Revolution, when true names were dangerous. She revived it, but gave it new purpose. She recruited not actors, but aristocrats, intellectuals, even politicians, all who longed to be someone else. And what happened to her? I asked. Rousseau's hands trembled slightly as he lifted his cup. She disappeared during the final masquerade. Holmes straightened. You mean she vanished in costume? Yes. The last performance was held not here, but in the catacombs beneath Montmartre. She played the Red Queen. I saw her descend into the hall myself. But when the performance ended, she was gone. Only her mask remained. Holmes tapped a finger against his knee. Was her daughter informed? Rousseau hesitated. We sent word, but perhaps not the truth. It was agreed that Lucienne had succumbed to illness abroad for her protection and perhaps her legacy. And who wrote the note left for Miss Thorne? Holmes asked. Beware. The second mask. Rousseau's eyes shifted. I do not know, but others survived. I've heard whispers, a masked figure seen again in London. The Violet Phantom. Holmes sat back. So we are not the only ones searching for answers. He turned to me. Watson, we must descend into the catacombs. I blinked. Surely. You don't mean no? But Holmes was already on his feet. There are truths beneath the stage, Watson, and secrets that only darkness will confess. Section. The Masquerade Beneath Montmartre. Our descent into the underworld of Paris began that very evening, under a slate-gray sky that promised rain. With Monsieur Rousseau's reluctant blessing, we found ourselves standing before an old stone entrance to the catacombs, locked to the public, but evidently not to all, for Rousseau had handed Holmes a rusted iron key from a drawer marked simply Minuet. Be cautious, he had warned. Some doors beneath Paris were never meant to be opened twice. Holmes said nothing, but the glint in his eye spoke volumes. He relished this pursuit, the blending of theatricality, deception, and danger. For him it was no longer merely a mystery. It was a stage. The entrance was cleverly concealed beneath the weather-worn facade of a shuttered wine cellar on the Rue de la Tour. A wrought iron gate, masked behind a false wall of barrels, led to a spiral stair of stone. Each step we took echoed into the dark, like the beat of a funeral drum dot as we descended. The lantern Holmes carried cast eerie shadows on the walls, illuminating skeletal graffiti carved by revolutionaries, priests, and poets. Bones, stacked in grim symmetry, lined the passages in quiet memorial to centuries long past. I imagine, I said softly, my voice swallowed by the damp air, this is not your first time among the dead. Holmes smirked. No, but the company always differs. After nearly 20 minutes of walking, We reached a corridor that deviated from the main ossuary unmarked, save for a faint emblem scratched into the lintel, a stylized velvet mask with one eye bleeding tears of ink. The seal of the society, Holmes muttered. This is the place. The corridor narrowed into a tunnel, and then into a carved stone archway, where a pair of wooden doors lacquered once in crimson stood slightly ajar. Holmes pushed them open, revealing a sight unlike any I had seen. The subterranean theater dot, it was vast and oval, with a stage at its center surrounded by worn marble benches. Gas sconces, long dormant, flickered now with dim blue flame. Whether from supernatural hand or Rousseau's preparations, I could not say. Behind the stage loomed a massive curtain, rotted but intact, still dyed a deep midnight purple. Masks of every shape and size adorned the walls. Horned, feathered, gilded, grotesque. The faces of long-forgotten roles. It's like a temple. I murmured. Holmes said nothing. He was moving now, slowly, his eyes scanning every inch of the room. He paused at the edge of the stage and knelt. There, he said, brushing away dust to reveal a small silver clasp, part of a gown, torn. He stood and moved toward the left wing. This is where Lucien would have exited, and where, evidently, she did not reappear. He stepped behind the curtain, and I followed. We found a second passage, rougher hewn, as if added later, and a door sealed with iron rivets. Holmes retrieved the key Rousseau had provided and turned it. The lock gave with a groan. Beyond was a small chamber, circular and bare, save for a single pedestal at its center. Upon it sat a velvet mask, identical to the one sketched in the journal, but stained now with something dark at its edges. Wine, perhaps, or something else. Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a pair of tweezers, carefully lifting the mask for examination. There are traces of rose essence, he murmured, and beneath it laudanum. Someone was drugged here, perhaps willingly. And then? I asked. He turned the mask slightly in the lantern's glow. Inside, stitched into the lining, was a name. Aveline. Her mother left this for her, Holmes said, as a warning or as a legacy. It seems the final performance was not an accident, but an initiation. I frowned. You believe Lucien Thorne intended to vanish? Holmes nodded slowly. To become the mask itself. To shed the self in favor of a myth. We left the chamber, returning to the stage. As Holmes inspected the balcony above, I walked. Among the seating, there, beneath one bench, my foot struck something, a silver cigarette case. I called Holmes over. He examined it quickly. Engraved initials, L.H. He opened it empty, save for a sliver of parchment. He unfolded it carefully. Written in precise hand, beware the audience with no eyes. He studied the note in silence. A message, perhaps from Lucien, or to her. I looked up at the balconies. What does it mean? He didn't answer immediately. Then, we are not alone. A gust of cold air swept across the theater, and the sconces flickered. From the far end of the chamber came a sound not of wind or shifting stone, but of fabric, of breath. We turned. In the rear alcove stood a figure clad in black, a long cloak falling to their boots, and a mask upon their face white porcelain, with lips painted violet. Holmes stepped forward. Mademoiselle Thorne? The figure didn't speak. Instead, it extended a gloved hand and beckoned us forward. Holmes did not hesitate. I followed reluctantly, hand upon the revolver beneath my coat. We crossed the chamber. As we reached the alcove, the figure turned and disappeared behind a hidden panel. We passed through into a narrow hallway, its walls lined with more masks, each lit from beneath by flickering candlelight. The figure stopped before a small room, opened the door, and stepped aside. Holmes entered first, then I thought it was a dressing chamber, lined with mirrors cracked and clouded by time. Upon a vanity sat an envelope, sealed in wax. Holmes picked it up. To those who would unmask the raven, it read. He broke the seal and read silently, his expression unreadable. Finally, he passed it to me. Inside was a confession. Eveline Thorne had discovered her mother's journals years ago. She had pursued the trail, joined the remnants of the society in London, and inherited the mask. But she had also discovered something darker, a second mask, once worn by a man known only as Le Corbeil, the Raven. He had used the society's performances as cover for manipulation, for blackmail, and some believed murder. He had vanished after Lucien's final performance, his role never concluded. Now, Eveline feared he had returned. The game, Holmes said slowly, has entered its final act. As we left the chamber, the masked figure was gone. Only a single violet feather remained, drifting in the air like an omen. Sherlock Holmes and the Secret Behind the Velvet Mask, Section 1. Must confess that despite my years of service alongside Sherlock Holmes, seldom have I seen him quite so pensive as he was the morning following our visit to the Garrick Club. He stood by the window of our Baker Street rooms, his lean frame outlined against the pale daylight that filtered through the soot-grimed panes. A barely touched breakfast sat cooling on the table beside him, and he had not spoken since his initial greeting. I, for my part, was nursing a cup of tea and pondering the significance of the few clues we had so far, the disappearance of Victor Ainsworth, the eccentricities of his will, the masked figure at the Garrick, and the odd reaction from Sir Leopold Cattermole regarding the painting of the late Lady Ainsworth. Holmes tapped the windowsill with his fingers in a measured rhythm, lost in contemplation. Finally he spoke without turning. "Watson, do you recall the date engraved beneath the Ainsworth portrait?" "Yes," I said, a bit surprised by the abrupt question. "It was 1879. And the date of Lady Eleanor's supposed death?" 1876. Holmes turned, the light catching the sharp planes of his face. "Then tell me, my good doctor, why would a portrait painted in 1879 depict a woman who died in 1876? I set down my cup. "Surely it's a posthumous portrait." "Possibly," Holmes allowed, beginning to pace now. "But that style, Watson, that was not the work of someone painting from memory or sketch. It had intimacy, immediacy. That painting was done from life." "You believe she didn't die in 1876? "I believe," Holmes said, "that someone has lied about Lady Eleanor's fate, and that the lie forms a cornerstone of this entire case." Just then a knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a small envelope upon a silver tray. This was left downstairs by a young boy. Mr. Holmes said it was urgent, she said. Setting it before him, Holmes opened the envelope delicately. Inside was a card plain vellum, but with an embossed black border. An elegant, slanted script was a single sentence. "The masquerade ends when the music stops. Midnight, Chapel of St. Cecilia. There was no signature. Holmes held the card up to the light as though hoping some watermark might disclose more. "The Chapel of St. Cecilia," he repeated. "Do you know it?" "An abandoned chapel in Hampstead," I said. "It was once used for private weddings, I believe. I attended one there years ago. It's been disused since the roof collapsed in 1885. "Indeed," Holmes said. "It seems our quarry is fond of theatrical settings. The Garrick Club, a ruined chapel. Someone has a flair for the dramatic." I frowned. "Holmes, are you certain we should respond to such an invitation? It could be a trap." "Undoubtedly," Holmes said. "But a trap may be just what we need. At times, Watson, it is prudent to step into the snare, provided one has already loosened the spring." He stood, reaching for his coat and hat. "Come, we've one visit to make before tonight. We're going to pay a call on the solicitor who handled the Ainsworth estate, Mr. Theophilus Stagg." "Another theater man?" I asked dryly. Holmes allowed a smile. "No, though his name would not be out of place upon a playbill. Mr. Theophilus Stagg received us in his chambers at Lincoln's Inn with the wary courtesy of a man accustomed to secrets. He was tall, bony, and wore thick spectacles that magnified his eyes to a curious degree. His office smelled of musty parchment and sealing wax. "Yes, I did handle Victor Ainsworth's affairs," he said, steepling his fingers over a folder. "Though I must confess, I found him a rather odd man. Paranoid, fastidious. He revised his will no less than 4 times in the final year of his life." "Did any of those revisions pertain to Lady Eleanor?" Holmes asked. Stagg hesitated. "That is where things grow strange. Lady Eleanor was declared legally deceased in 1876, as you may know. There was an inquest after she vanished from their country estate in Kent. No body was found, but she was presumed drowned in the pond near the orchard." "Presumed," Holmes echoed. "Yes, Victor was never satisfied. He continued to issue private notices under a false name, offering reward for any information. He suspected foul play, or so he claimed." "Did he ever believe she was still alive?" Stagg leaned forward. "More than believe. In 1882, he came to me with instructions to draft a codicil protecting the estate in the event of Lady Eleanor's reappearance. He insisted I create a resurrection clause, his words not merely to account for fraud, but to return all property to her should she be found." "And did she ever reappear?" Stagg hesitated again. "I ask," Holmes said softly, "because someone who bears a striking resemblance to her or her portrait appeared at the Garrick Club last night, wearing a velvet mask." Stagg blanched. "Then it's true," he whispered. "I thought I saw her once years ago near Charing Cross. She wore a veil and was gone before I could call out. I convinced myself it was a dream." "Not a dream," Holmes murmured. "A ghost with a pulse." He stood abruptly. "Thank you, Mr. Stagg. You have been most enlightened." Outside, the London afternoon had turned slate-gray. Rain misted the air. Holmes pulled up his collar and set off down the cobbled path with purpose. "It all fits," he said. The feigned death, the mysterious codicils, the masked woman whose voice trembled when she uttered Victor's name. "You believe she is alive?" "I believe," Holmes said, "that tonight we shall see the end of a performance that began nearly 2 decades ago, and that the truth behind that velvet mask will shake more than just inheritance laws." That evening we arrived at the chapel of St. Cecilia just before midnight. It was a crumbling structure, half swallowed by ivy, its stained glass windows shattered long ago, its roof partially collapsed. Yet within, someone had lit candles, hundreds of them. The nave glowed like a cavern of memory dot, and in the center stood the masked figure, clad again in black velvet, facing the altar. Music drifted from a small phonograph beside her, an old waltz, ghostly in its distortion. Holmes stepped forward. "Lady Eleanor," he said. The woman turned. Her eyes shone behind the mask, but her voice was firm. "Then you know. I know you faked your death. That Victor helped you disappear, though he never forgave himself for it. That you returned only to ensure his will could not be challenged by those who would twist his memory." "I had no choice," she said. "Victor's family tried to destroy us. I feared for my life." Holmes nodded. "And the masquerade? The messages? The club? Why draw us into it?" "Because truth needs witnesses," she said. "Victor would have wanted someone like you to understand, to preserve what mattered. You are, after all, the detective who sees what others miss." Holmes was silent a long moment. Then he stepped back. "Come, Watson, our part here is done." And as the music played on and the mask began to fall, I realized what Holmes already knew, that this was not merely the end of a case, but the quiet conclusion of a love story hidden behind velvet and silence. Section: The woman at the altar. The wind had picked up by the time we returned to Baker Street, lashing against the windows with a ferocity that made the gas lamps flicker and groan. Holmes said nothing during the cab ride. His hands were pressed together, steepled beneath his chin, eyes half-lidded and inward, as though the night's revelations were coalescing into something final yet unfinished. I, too, was absorbed in thought. Lady Eleanor, or the woman purporting to be her, had spoken with conviction, yet no proof had been offered save her masked presence and carefully arranged allusions. Still, the emotional weight of her confession lingered, and I could not help but feel sympathy. We were barely through the sitting-room door before Holmes threw off his coat and set to pacing. His stride was quicker than usual. Nervous almost, something in the night's encounter had unsettled even him. "She is not a liar," he said at last, stopping to face the fire. "No," I agreed, sinking into my armchair. "But that does not make her entirely truthful either." "Quite so," Holmes replied. "She tells a portion of the story, hers. But there are pieces missing, gaps where the light does not reach." He turned abruptly to the bookshelf and retrieved a worn volume, a directory of parish records. Sitting at his desk, he flipped through it with speed and precision. Lady Eleanor's death was recorded officially in 1876, no burial, but a declaration of presumed drowning by the Kent coroner's office. The estate was held in abeyance for a year before Victor Ainsworth resumed legal ownership. And now, he paused, tapping the page. A private donation was made to St. Cecilia's Restoration Fund in 1881, amounting to £500. The donor's name? E.V. Bellamy. "That could be anyone," I said. Holmes looked up. "Or it could be a carefully chosen pseudonym, Eleanor Victor Bellamy." A subtle nod to both their names. A way to maintain presence without exposure. The chapel was being restored in secrecy, even as Victor continued his public mourning. I frowned. But the restoration was never completed, which suggests it was not intended to be. The repairs were cosmetic, just enough to render the chapel safe for occasional use. A private sanctuary, Watson, nothing more. A hiding place. Holmes stood and moved to the violin case beside the hearth. He opened it, but did not play. Instead, he ran a bow across the strings. Softly, one long note, low and tremulous, filled the room. "There is one more thread to pull," he said. "Tomorrow we pay a call to Lord Wexley, the peer who contested Ainsworth's will." "The very one," Holmes confirmed, setting down the instrument. "He claims Victor was mad, that the will was the product of senility or manipulation. But perhaps, just perhaps, he knows more about the lady who vanished than he admits." Lord Peregrine Wexley's residence in Belgrave Square was an imposing monument of columned marble and austerity. We were admitted after a brief wait, and shown to a study thick with dark paneling, the scent of leather-bound books, and the faint metallic tang of aged pipe smoke. Wexley was a broad-shouldered man with silver hair cropped close and a mouth fixed in permanent disapproval. He did not rise as we entered, merely gestured with 2 fingers to the chairs opposite his desk. I agreed to this meeting. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "because I have nothing to hide. Though I wonder why the late Victor Ainsworth's delusions require further examination." Holmes seated himself lightly. "Delusion is a curious term, Lord Wexley. Might you be referring to his belief that Lady Eleanor was still alive?" Wexley's eyes narrowed. He was obsessed with her. Even after the accident, he refused to move on. I warned him he was throwing away his fortune on ghost hunts and seances. Utter nonsense. "You were close to Lady Eleanor?" I interjected. "She was my cousin," he said coldly, "and a gentle soul, too fragile for Victor's bohemian indulgences. He was a man of the theater, dangerously romantic, a dreamer. She disappeared, and he descended into absurdity." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Yet you contested the will." Wexley sat back, fingers steepled. "Because it was absurd. He left a substantial portion to a trust administered by an unnamed beneficiary, a woman who never appeared in court. Even your Scotland Yard could not locate her. What sort of beneficiary leaves no trace?" "One in hiding," Holmes said. The room fell silent. Then Wexley added with a sneer, "If you've seen this woman, you're chasing ghosts. I pray you don't waste more time indulging a madman's fantasy." Holmes stood. "A man may be mad, Lord Wexley, or he may simply be mourning in a manner too complex for polite society to understand." We turned to go, but at the threshold Holmes paused. "One last question. The painting of Lady Eleanor at the Garrick Club, it was donated by Victor?" "No," Wexley said. "It was given anonymously to the club in 1880, 2 years before his death." Victor was enraged. He considered it a forgery. Holmes smiled faintly. "And yet it remains there in pride of place." Outside, Holmes hailed a cab with an urgency I hadn't seen since the case began. He climbed in, eyes burning with conviction. "Watson, this mystery is not about a murder, nor is it about a theft or a disappearance. It is about a performance of play acted over decades, with the audience deceived until the final curtain. And who is the playwright?" I asked. Holmes was silent a moment. "Lady Eleanor," he said softly, "but perhaps not the only one." That night, Holmes remained awake long after I retired. I awoke once in the darkness to see him by the window again, silhouetted against the street lamp glow, fingers clasped behind his back. The storm had ended, but something in his posture told me that the real tempest was yet to come. Section: The Final Invitation. The morning after our tense exchange with Lord Wexley began with a brittle chill that seemed to settle deep within Baker Street. Frost clung stubbornly to the window panes, and each breath came as a cloud. Holmes remained at his desk, tip-tapping a single pencil as though composing a melody of deduction. The scattered documents, maps, and the violet-bloomed mask lay before him in deliberate disarray. I entered with 2 cups of tea, setting one before him. He glanced up, eyes sharp, alert. "We have 3 remaining threads, Watson," he said quietly. "A chapel, a painting, and an invitation." "Invitation?" I repeated, unsure which he meant. He reached for the violets in a small vase on the mantel and pinched one thoughtfully. "A second message came by post half an hour ago. No seal, no name. Just an invitation. At dusk precisely, return where the audience awaits. Tonight the Raven shall deliver the final act. The Garrick Club Ballroom. Dusk," I mused. "We already visited the chapel. Meanwhile, the painting remains at the Garrick. It seems they want us back right into the lion's den." Holmes barely acknowledged my comment, but the set to his jaw betrayed him. "Yes, they want us back, but it is no trap. It is a stage, and tonight, Watson, we are the principals." That evening I prepared myself with the care one reserves for battlefield maneuvers. Holmes, however, took a less cautious approach. A tailored evening suit, unassuming but elegant, but with a violet handkerchief peeking from his breast pocket. The detail was too deliberate to be decorative. It was a calling card. We boarded the hansom cab toward Pall Mall, the city's gas lamps flickering in the frost-bitten air. The streets were hushed, as though the city itself was holding its breath. As we neared the Garrick Club, the cab slowed. The imposing facade was draped in soft lamplight. At the entrance stood a footman, dressed in full evening livery, who bowed us in without a word. Inside the lobby, the air was thick with tobacco and low conversation. Holmes led me through a carved archway, past portraits of elocutionists and dramatists, finally arriving in the expansive ballroom. Yet it was not what I remembered. The space had been transformed into a chaise velvet curtains, shadowy alcoves, and gleaming floors faintly reflective of hidden lights. A low platform had been erected before the stage, and at its center sat an empty chair, lit by a single purple spotlight. Above, a lone chandelier flickered dryly, offering more form than illumination. A murmur passed through the assembled company, men in black ties, women in silent anticipation. All masked. Holmes grasped my arm. "The Raven will speak," he whispered. "When the music begins, listen not to the notes, but to the silences." Then the music unfolded a cello, deep and mournful, playing a familiar motif. It was the same melody from Red Hill Chapel, the waltz, slowed almost to a dirge. Suddenly, from the gallery above, a figure appeared, wearing a raven mask, black, beak pronounced, features angular, draped in a cloak that swallowed the light. He descended the stairs with a fluid grace silent as smoke. The crowd parted, forming a... He held it before him, gazing at it as though a deadly cobweb dot. Then he slipped it onto his own face. Gasps erupted. Holmes stood almost statuesque, masked by this strange, silent symbol. Even in the faint purple beam, his posture was resolute. Refusing to betray discomfort, the Raven raised his arms. From a side arch, a curtain parted, revealing Eleanor. She emerged, maskless now, prepared to speak. Her hair gleamed, her gown simple yet graceful. The cello resumed, a slow background. Eleanor stepped forward, pale but stern. "I cannot continue this charade," she said, her voice resonant. "My life has been built on lies, fear masked as identity. My husband, my obligations, the secrets of my mother's society." She paused. The ball of silver light on the stage captured the sheen in her eyes. "But tonight I unmask, not you, but myself." She extended her hand toward Holmes. Holmes inclined his head, mask and all. I waited, gloved finger trembling. Then Eleanor turned to the Raven. "Who are you?" The Raven simply pointed to the concealed ladder behind the audience. Music ceased. Tension thickened. Holmes lifted the mask from his own face, handing it to Eleanor. "Detective," she said softly, "you chose to stand masked, to seek the truth in obscurity. Now stand beside me without artifice." The Raven stepped forward revealed. Now, it was Stagg, the solicitor, spectacles glinting. A collective gasp. Holmes studied him. Stagg removed his own mask slowly. "I was the Raven. I orchestrated the invitations, the performances meant to protect Eleanor's secret until trust was earned, but my role has ended. The final scene calls for my curtain." Eleanor clasped Holmes's hand. "You see truth, Holmes, not masks." Holmes nodded. "Yes." The audience dispersed silently. When we returned to Baker Street, early morning dawned mild and clear, as though offering forgiveness for the night's drama. Holmes placed the Raven mask on the mantel. Eleanor stood beside him. "Your society," Holmes began gently, "was built on illusion, but your legacy rests in revelation. It now belongs to you." She smiled faintly. "Thank you." "But I had no proof until tonight." Holmes nodded. "Proof is a matter of perception. You have my admiration, and your story will be told." With that, Eleanor left section. Echoes from a hidden chamber. The early morning sun, barely a suggestion in the sky, cast a pale hue over Baker Street, gilding the edges of rooftops in diluted gold. The quietude of our rooms stood, in marked contrast to the night before, an evening rife with veiled performances and unspoken truths. Holmes had not slept. He stood by the fireplace, the Raven mask resting upon the mantel, his eyes distant yet sharp, as though following invisible threads that wound through the fog of his deductions. "I take it we are not yet finished?" I said, pouring 2 cups of tea, the clink of china a welcome ordinary sound. Holmes accepted the cup absent-mindedly, his gaze fixed on the mask. "We have arrived at the opera's penultimate act, Watson. But as with all great performances, the true resolution lies not in what is seen, but in what is hidden." He walked over to the desk and unfurled a sheet of parchment, one of the notes retrieved from Lord Wexley's files. On it a cipher glimmered in violet ink beneath the visible text. Holmes held it up to the light and murmured, "Ultraviolet. Ink common in certain theatrical circles, especially among illusionists. This cipher reveals coordinates, a street name, Queenhithe Lane, near the embankment." I stirred from my seat. "What might we find there?" Holmes turned toward me, his voice low. "An address long believed to have burned down in the fire of '85, a private music conservatory that belonged to the Bellamy family. It appears it was rebuilt in secret." I blinked. "Why maintain such secrecy?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. Because not all music is meant for public ears, Watson. Some compositions are meant only for those who can decipher their meaning. Within the hour we stood at the edge of Queen Hithe, the Thames lapping sluggishly at the stones beyond. The houses here bore the fatigue of time-soot-streaked windows, doors bowed by age, gas lamps creaking on crooked posts. Holmes led us to number 14, a townhouse shrouded in ivy and shadow. The windows were curtained from within, but faint strains of sound discordant. Experimental slipped through the cracks like escaping ghosts. Holmes rapped thrice on the door, a rhythm he'd used once before in a case involving a pianist who composed with poisoned ink. We waited. Silence. He reached for the brass handle and tried the latch. It opened without protest. The interior was dim, the hallway lined with portraits obscured beneath gauze sheets. A cracked chandelier swayed gently above, moved by some unseen breath. A strong odor of linseed oil and resin lingered in the air. Holmes stepped in first, his eyes scanning the vestibule. "Notice the absence of dust," he said quietly. "Someone has been here within the past day." We moved deeper into the house, past what had once been a drawing room now filled with disassembled instruments, some of them half-finished violins hanging like skeletons from hooks. Manuscript pages covered the surfaces, some scrawled with frantic notations, others with geometric symbols superimposed on musical staffs dot in the rear. Of the house we found the conservatory, a circular room with a domed skylight shrouded in soot. A single grand piano sat in the center, its keys exposed, the lid open like a yawning mouth. Then Holmes froze. "There," he said, pointing toward a segment of the wooden floor near the wall. The boards were of a different grain, slightly warped. Holmes knelt and tapped twice. Hollow. With practiced efficiency, he pried open the concealed trapdoor, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. A subtle vibration rose from below, neither mechanical nor musical, but something in between. "Shall we descend into the abyss, Watson?" "With the greatest reluctance," I replied, "but also with you." The stairway creaked with each step. The air grew cooler, tinged with a metallic scent. At the bottom we entered a chamber not unlike a crypt. Shelves lined the walls, each crammed with locked boxes, rolled parchment, and preserved journals. But at the center stood a strange contraption, part organ, part phonograph, and entirely unlike anything I had seen. Pipes jutted from the top like mechanical antlers, while a tangle of wires ran from its base into the stone wall. The nameplate read, "Oral Codex No. 3 by R. Bellamy." "Good heavens," I muttered. "What is it?" "A recording device," Holmes answered, running his fingers over its surface. "Not of sound in the conventional sense, but of frequency signatures. Each composition contains a unique resonance pattern. This machine stores those patterns. As a form of encryption," he pointed to a drawer labeled R. Bellamy, Final Works. Within it lay a small brass cylinder. Holmes inserted it into the codex and turned the crank. The room filled with an eerie, spectral sound, a blend of music and static, as though someone were attempting to play a melody from the other side of a storm. Then a voice barely discernible, muffled and distorted, broke through the noise. "They know, Eleanor, keep it hidden. Music is the key." The message ended in a burst of static. Holmes's face darkened. "This is the reason for all the secrecy. Eleanor was not merely hiding her husband's legacy, she was protecting a code embedded in his music. A code for what? I asked. Holmes turned to me. That, my dear Watson, is what we must discover next. But one thing is now certain. Someone is after this code. And I do not believe they will stop at cryptic messages or veiled performances. We secured the cylinder and carefully documented the apparatus before leaving the chamber. As we stepped back into the frost-laced dawn, Holmes's face bore a grim cast. "Tonight," he said, "we shall meet again with Eleanor Bellamy. She must be made to understand that the game is shifted." And what of Stagg, the Raven? Holmes's eyes narrowed. I no longer believe he was working alone. We returned to Baker Street as the bells of St. Dunstan chimed the quarter hour. Holmes sat by the window, staring into the street as the day unfolded. I knew he was not watching the people below, but listening for notes in the silence, for rhythms in the mundane, and I knew that whatever lay behind the velvet mask, the final act had yet to be played. Section the mask unveiled. The hour was just past 6 when Holmes rose from the settee with the suddenness of one who had waited long enough for the world to catch up to his deductions. "We must see her before they do. Watson," he said, fastening his cloak with swift precision. "You refer to Miss Eleanor Bellamy?" "I do, though I suspect that title conceals as much as the mask. And should we delay, I fear she may vanish like the final note of an unplayed sonata." We secured the codex cylinder in a velvet pouch, Holmes, slipping it into the interior of his coat with care bordering on reverence. The streets of London were awash in fog and the golden sputter of gas lamps as we hailed a hansom cab and directed it toward Belgrave Square. The Bellamy residence, an imposing Georgian townhouse with ivy curled about its wrought iron fencing, stood in silent indifference to our arrival. A thin plume of smoke rose from one chimney, indicating life within. Holmes's knock was answered not by the familiar housekeeper, but by a young man with an artistic pallor and a limp. "Yes?" he asked with wary civility. Holmes bowed. "Mr. Felix March, I presume? Composer and confidant of Miss Bellamy?" March nodded slowly. "She is not receiving visitors." Holmes stepped forward with an ease that brooked no refusal. "She'll receive us today." Inside, the house bore the tension of a room awaiting applause or disaster. March led us through the vestibule into a drawing-room heavy with velvet curtains, half-covered easels, and "You gave us enough to follow. But we are not the only ones, Miss Bellamy, or shall I say Mrs. Reinhardt?" She tensed slightly, but offered no denial. Holmes set the pouch on the piano and withdrew the cylinder. This was recovered from the hidden chamber beneath Quinhithe Lane. We know its value not merely as a musical relic, but as a cipher of your husband's work. There are others who understand that value, too. Her fingers traced the piano's keys absently. It was never meant to be discovered. Not yet. The codex is ... unfinished. That recording is but a key to a greater vault, my husband's final composition, which conceals a blueprint. He believed art could safeguard secrets in a way no lock ever could. "A blueprint for what?" I asked. "A system of resonance," March interjected. Anton Reinhardt theorized that harmonic frequencies could be used to alter perception-induced trances, manipulate memory. He wrote that the human mind could be tuned like a violin, Watson. Holmes gave a grim nod. Weaponized music. I've seen stranger ideas in government research files. And now someone else is chasing that secret. Perhaps they already possess parts of it. Eleanor's voice dropped. That someone is Julian Stagg? Holmes's eyes narrowed. Yes, he was Anton's rival, she continued. They studied together under the same Viennese master, but Anton abandoned academia when he realized his discoveries would be misused. Stagg did not share his scruples. And you believe he seeks to complete your husband's work? Holmes asked. Not complete it, corrupt it. He will perform the Velvet Mask Suite tonight at the Grand Marlowe Theater, but the piece he will play is not my husband's original composition. It has been altered. Embedded within it is a resonance frequency that, when played in full, can affect an entire audience's neural pathways. Good heavens, I said. You mean mass suggestion? More precisely, induced emotional states. Confusion, fear, elation, compliance. In the wrong hands, it could become a symphony of manipulation. Holmes turned to March. And you? March hesitated. I helped encode the original. I was Anton's apprentice after his death. But when Eleanor refused to release the manuscripts, I grew bitter. I shared fragments with Stagg. I didn't know what he intended until it was too late. Holmes nodded slowly. Then we must attend. Tonight's performance, not as patrons, but as disruptors. Eleanor retrieved a black folder from beneath the piano bench and handed it to Holmes. This is the true Velvet Mask uncorrupted. If you can substitute this score for Stagg's, Holmes smiled faintly. I dare say we've switched music on worse stages. And what of the codex cylinder? She asked. It stays with me until this affair is over. I have a place more secure than any vault. By nightfall, the Grand Marlowe Theater glowed like a cathedral. Footmen ushered in London's elite artists, diplomats, and critics gathered to witness Stagg's Velvet Mask premiere. Holmes and I entered through the rear, clad in stagehand coats, the score hidden within a satchel. Backstage was a hive of controlled chaos violinists tuning strings, harpists checking sheet music. Holmes moved like a specter, his fingers deft as he located the conductor's stand. There, with the precision of a forger, he replaced Stagg's corrupted composition with Eleanor's original dot. As the lights dimmed and the orchestra hushed, Stagg emerged onto the stage, tall, austere, with silver hair tied back and dark gloves on his hands. He bowed low before the audience and turned to the ensemble. Holmes and I took our seats in the private balcony. The overture began, but instead of the whispered discord Stagg expected, the music rose in pure crystalline harmonics Anton Reinhardt's untainted design. For a moment, confusion flickered across Stagg's face. Then fury. He turned mid-performance, searching for the source of betrayal. But the orchestra continued. A transformation swept the theater, not of mindless submission, but of stillness, awe. Tears welled in the eyes of listeners. March's face in the wings was pale and luminous. The true Velvet Mask had never been a tool of control, but a plea for empathy. Anton's final gift. Stagg tried to interrupt, but was escorted from the stage by theater guards. Holmes had anticipated resistance and secured their cooperation in advance. After the final note faded. The applause thundered not for Stagg, but for the music's soul, restored. Back in Baker Street, Holmes handed me the mask Eleanor once wore. It never shielded a villain. He said only a widow's grief and a composer's legacy. And Stagg, disgraced? He'll retreat to the shadows once more, but his influence will dwindle. And the codex? Holmes set it on the mantel beside the Stradivarius. Safe, he said, for now. I opened my journal, as always, to begin my entry. The curtain had fallen. The secret behind the velvet mask lay revealed not in power or vengeance, but in the integrity of music and memory. And Sherlock Holmes, ever the master of logic, had once again proven that the most complex puzzles are often composed not in code, but in compassion. Section. The score of shadows. It was just past 8 o'clock when we returned to Baker Street, our boots wet from the slush of a prematurely thawed London night. Holmes moved with the energy of a man possessed, not frantic, but focused. The drawing room glowed with lamplight as he laid out a fresh sheet of music manuscript upon the table. The original score, the true velvet mask, was now in our possession. Yet even with the immediate danger thwarted at the Grand Marlowe, Holmes knew that our adversary had not yet played his final note. There's more to this than artistic rivalry, Holmes murmured, studying the calligraphy of Anton Reinhardt's. Notation. Stagg was merely a conductor of someone else's composition. There's a deeper patron lurking behind the curtain. You believe he was acting under orders? I believe he was commissioned. I stared at the manuscript, the lines of musical notation trailing in elegant curves and crescendos. It was beautiful, almost sacred, and yet I could sense the undercurrent of dread it invoked in Holmes. Do you still suspect a link to the political unrest across the Channel? I asked. Holmes tapped his fingers lightly on the edge of the manuscript. Consider the timing, Watson. The coded melody, the hypnotic theories Reinhardt developed. It's all too tempting for those who seek power without principle, influence, an audience, and you sway a salon. Influence a composer, and you sway a nation. But we disrupted the performance. Stagg is exposed. Surely the threat has passed? Holmes gave a half-smile that did not reach his eyes. That, my dear Watson, is the greatest miscalculation we might make. He crossed to the mantel, retrieving the codex cylinder from its velvet pouch. With deft hands, he loaded it into his phonograph. A mechanical hiss gave way to the faint hum of needle meeting groove, and then a single violin sang out, sweet and spectral. The melody was haunting, rising in arpeggios, then descending like sighs. It was the same we had heard from Eleanor at the chapel in section, and the same that had captivated the Grand Marlowe's audience the night before. But this version was subtly different. Holmes reached for a magnifying glass and studied the grooves of the rotating cylinder. There's a discrepancy, he said. Listen. He slowed the rotation by hand, dragging the pitch down. What emerged beneath the notes was almost imperceptible, no longer music, but a rhythmic pulsing, like a second message encoded beneath the harmony. Like a Morse pattern, I said, leaning in. Holmes nodded. Precisely. Reinhardt's genius wasn't just musical, it was mechanical. This cylinder is not just a recording, it's a cipher. He paused the phonograph and moved to his desk, pulling out a notebook of transpositions and cryptographic tables. For the better part of an hour, Holmes translated the auditory pulses into letters, stopping only once to recheck a sequence. When he was finished, He exhaled slowly and handed me the page dotted red. Beneath the black velvet midnight. Redhill Chapel. A chill passed through me. Redhill? I said, but that place was closed years ago. I remember reading it had been condemned structurally unsound. Holmes's gaze was fixed on the words. Redhill Chapel was where Reinhardt conducted his earliest experiments with sound modulation, hidden in plain sight. If the rest of his work survived, it would be there. And if someone else knows that we're not the only ones who can, decipher the code, I finished grimly. Holmes rose to his full height. We must get there before midnight. Whoever else is seeking this secret, be it Stagg's patron or another, will come tonight. We traveled by cab through increasingly narrow and fog-bound streets, the air thick with a dampness that chilled the bones. Redhill was an area I had visited once during my army days back, then a rural patch on the southern skirts of London. Now it was more ghost town than suburb. Redhill Chapel loomed in the dark like a forgotten relic. Ivy strangled its stone walls. Its windows were empty sockets, its bell tower leaning precariously to one side. It was a house of worship abandoned. By both God and man, we approached with caution, our footsteps muffled by the wet grass. Holmes produced a lantern from his satchel and directed me toward the vestry door, a rotting wooden archway barely held in place. Inside, the chapel smelled of mildew and forgotten time. Pews were overturned, and moss crept across the floor tiles. The only sound was our own breathing, amplified by the emptiness. "Holmes," I whispered, "are we certain the message meant here?" He gestured toward the altar. Midnight, beneath the velvet. We moved forward. Holmes's lantern beam fell upon the tattered remains of a black velvet curtain, once hung as a backdrop to the altar's crucifix. He pulled it aside. Behind it lay. Suddenly a soft click echoed in the darkness, the unmistakable sound of a revolver being cocked. "Very good, Mr. Holmes," came a voice from the shadows. We turned to see a man step from the gloom tall, lean and pale, his eyes rimmed with sleepless ambition. It was the man we had seen at the Grand Marlow, the one who had lingered in the wings, Lord Cyril Rathbone, a minor nobleman with major aspirations. "Lord Rathbone," Holmes said calmly. Rathbone smiled. This score of shadows was never meant for the public stage. I had hoped Stagg would see it through, but he failed me. "You, however, have brought me the full archive." He raised the pistol. "You won't leave this chapel, Mr. Holmes." Holmes tilted his head. "Perhaps, but you misunderstand one crucial point." "And what is that?" Holmes glanced upward. "You're not the only one with an orchestra." From the stairwell behind us came the sudden clatter of boots. Inspector Lestrade and 2 constables emerged, revolvers drawn. Rathbone turned, but it was too late. Holmes smiled. "I took the liberty of sending Lestrade the decoded message hours before we left Baker Street. You see, I expected you would follow the same breadcrumbs." Rathbone dropped his weapon in fury. "You meddling genius?" Holmes supplied. Lestrade secured the nobleman in cuffs, while Holmes turned back to the archive, reverently gathering key documents. "We'll catalog these," he said softly, "and ensure their protection from the greed of men like Rathbone." Emerged from the chapel just as the church bell rusted and unused let out a groaning chime. Midnight. Holmes turned toward me, the glow of the lantern reflecting in his eyes. "One final act remains, Watson," he said, and with that, we made our way back to London, carrying not only answers but the weight of a legacy nearly lost. Section. Legacy and Requiem. The following day dawned gray and rain slicked, as if the city itself wished to wash away the last threads of the shadowy drama that had unfolded the night before. Baker Street, ever unchanged in its bustling indifference, seemed too mundane a setting for the secrets Holmes and I now carried back from the underworld of Red Hill Chapel. Holmes had risen early, though he had not slept, and now paced before the hearth, pipe clenched between his teeth, smoke curling into the dim-lit room like spirits lingering after a séance. On the table between us lay Reinhardt's final manuscript, a piece not of music, but of theory labeled in looping German script, Zur Kontrolle der Harmonie, Das Projekt Maskenlied, the project of the masked song. I leaned over the parchment, brow furrowed. This cannot be simply a composition, Holmes. No, he replied absently. It's a schematic, a system by which musical arrangements could be designed not merely to evoke emotion, but to suggest thought. Embedded tonal cues that function like commands to the subconscious. Are you suggesting Reinhardt's velvet mask wasn't just symbolic? That it was an actual form of psychological suggestion, an instrument of influence? Holmes exhaled slowly. Not a suggestion, Watson, a mechanism. We often think of music as something ethereal, but Reinhardt understood it as engineering. He theorized that human responses could be calibrated, manipulated, much like reactions to light or pressure. A sufficiently complex arrangement could bypass rational processing altogether. I felt an involuntary chill, and Rathbone intended to use it. Indeed, he sought more than notoriety. He believed a composition of sufficient potency could shape popular thought. Imagine a concert played to Parliament, or an overture released across Europe in times of turmoil. Ideas planted like seeds beneath a melody. The implications struck me dumb for a moment. But it didn't work, not completely, I said. Stagg's performance fell apart because the composition was incomplete. The copy Rathbone possessed lacked a critical counterpoint, a fail-safe. Reinhardt built into the velvet mask a musical antidote hidden in the closing bars. Only with that final chord could the spell be broken. And that chord? Holmes tapped the manuscript. Is in here, unperformed, unpublished, locked away until now. We sat in silence for a long while. The fire cracked in the grate. Outside, the sounds of horses and hawkers carried up through the open window, a reminder that life marched on even when brushing shoulders with peril. At last, Holmes stood. There is one more visit to make. He said no more, but I knew he meant to find Eleanor. We located her that evening at the Conservatoire in West Hampstead, a small, elegant school where she now taught music to promising but impoverished students. She greeted us with a wary composure, her eyes flickering between our faces like a candle wary of the wind. "You came to arrest me?" she asked without preamble. Holmes shook his head. "Not today. We've apprehended Rathbone. Stagg will testify." She nodded slowly. "I suppose it was inevitable, but I'll not apologize for safeguarding Anton's work." "You needn't," Holmes said, "though I will ask for something else." From inside his coat he produced the true velvet mask, a manuscript now freed of its false interpretations and dangerous omissions. "I wish you to perform this," he said, "one time with the antidote, so that the world might hear Reinhardt's music as he intended, not as a weapon, but as a lament, a revelation, a requiem." Eleanor stared at the parchment as though it were her beloved's ghost made flesh. "Where?" she asked, voice low. "St. Cecilia's Hall," he replied. "Tomorrow evening. A private gathering of minds we trust, music historians, scholars, skeptics, and one inspector from Scotland Yard. No fanfare, just truth." She hesitated. "Then I'll do it. For Anton." The next evening unfolded with a hush rather than fanfare. Holmes arranged for the event to be held in secret, behind closed doors, the guest list tightly controlled. I sat beside Lestrade, who looked distinctly out of place among the concert-goers, and academics. Eleanor stepped onto the modest stage of St. Cecilia's, wearing a gown of soft velvet, her hair pinned simply, her eyes resolute. She did not speak. She lifted her violin, nodded once to the silent audience, and began to play. The melody, Reinhardt's Velvet Mask, rose like mist from the strings. It was haunting as ever, but no longer ominous. The harmonics no longer clawed at the mind. Instead, they offered a glimpse into sorrow, into beauty, into love both lost and eternal. And when she reached the final bars, those precious hidden chords, there came a stillness over the room, unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was not hypnosis. It was understanding. When she finished, the silence held, and then, slowly, we stood. Not in ovation, but in reverence. Later, over brandy. In the foyer, Lestrade shook his head. "You know, Holmes, I can't even whistle. But I think I understand what that music was trying to say." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Then Reinhardt's legacy has done its job." He turned to Eleanor, who stood by the fire, her violin case in hand. "You've returned it to the world," he said. She nodded. "And I'll now let it go. There are no more secrets left in that music." Holmes turned to me. "Come, Watson. London will not pause for our sentiment." As we left St. Cecilia's, I glanced once more at the hall. Behind us, its stained glass windows dark. The echo of a ghost melody fading into night. Back at Baker Street, Holmes sat at his desk, sorting through what remained of the Reinhardt archive. He placed the final pages into an envelope and sealed it with wax. "To be donated to the British Museum," he said, "with conditions. Let it be studied, but never performed without the counterpoint." "Safeguarded," I said. "Preserved." He corrected. "So that genius might inspire, never harm." He leaned back, fingers steepled. I reached for my journal. As I penned the final pages of our latest case, I paused to observe him, the great detective with the keenest mind in Europe, who now stared into the fire, hearing music only he could comprehend. The Velvet Mask. "Our rote has been lifted." Section. The final note unplayed. The fog was thick that evening, draping the gas lamps of Bloomsbury in woolen halos, as Holmes and I returned from West Hampstead. Neither of us spoke until we reached the familiar threshold of Baker Street, where Mrs. Hudson greeted us with her usual subdued courtesy and the comfort of a warm lamp glowing against the shadows. Once inside, Holmes tossed his Inverness cape across the back of his armchair, not bothering with the hook, and strode to the hearth as though pursued by invisible specters. The crimson embers crackled, casting flickering shapes across the walls of our sitting room. while I poured us both tea from the silver pot, though I doubted he would touch his. "You've made your decision," I said gently, handing him the cup. He nodded, though he did not reach for it. "It is the only resolution that serves both truth and conscience." The meaning of his words required no clarification. The performance at St. Cecilia's had been agreed upon in principle, but it remained a precarious undertaking. With the full velvet mask manuscript now in hand, complete, authentic, and capable of doing what even its composer had not foreseen, it was imperative that it be handled with both reverence and caution. And yet Holmes was troubled, more so than I had seen since the days of the Reichenbach incident. He paced slowly, fingers pressed together beneath his chin, the firelight catching the gaunt angles of his face. "What weighs on you, Holmes?" I asked. "The composition," he murmured. "Reinhardt's final expression. We understand its mechanics, its counterpoint, its influence. But what we have yet to understand, Watson, is how far Rathbone had planned to take it." I leaned forward. "You believe there is more?" "I believe," he said, "that he had assisted someone with reach, someone capable of disseminating the composition beyond a concert hall. Reinhardt's theories were years ahead of their time. Such an individual would not simply use the velvet mask once and abandon it. No, this was a pilot, a rehearsal for something much greater." His tone sent a tremor down my spine. "And you think Rathbone left behind some clue, a further scheme?" "He was too meticulous to act alone," Holmes replied, "and he knew he would not have time to perfect the counterpoint. Yet he forged ahead. That kind of recklessness is rarely born from desperation. It's born from certainty that another will carry the work forward." He crossed the room to the small cabinet that contained our most guarded artifacts and withdrew the violin, the true Reinhardt instrument Eleanor had once feared would be misused. He ran his fingers along the varnished wood, then turned to me. "We must visit the archives beneath King's College." "At this hour?" I asked. He nodded. "Rathbone studied there. If he passed on Reinhardt's research or left any trail of successors, the records may tell us." Within the hour, we were descending the damp stone steps into the undercroft of King's College Library, a cavernous repository of manuscripts, journals, and faculty correspondences dating back a century. Holmes, with special permission secured in advance, handed a signed letter to the night clerk, who led us by lantern into the restricted faculty archive. "Here," Holmes gestured. Rathbone's early lectures were published under the Music and Harmonics Department. "Let us begin with his correspondence." The clerk unlocked a small iron-gated section labeled MH 1890s and withdrew a brittle leather portfolio. Inside was an assortment of letters, lecture notes, and a curious document bearing a red wax seal in the shape of a stylized lyre. Holmes narrowed his eyes, breaking the seal gently. "It's in code," he said almost instantly. "German cipher?" I asked. "No, this is based on the Guidonian hexachord, a musical encryption system used by Renaissance composers to hide messages in musical notation. Very obscure." He produced a pencil and quickly began translating the notation scrawled across the parchment's lower margin. Each note corresponded to a letter using the medieval psalmization scheme. After several minutes, he read aloud, "The next movement begins at midnight, 3 days hence, Covent Garden, beneath the theater. The circle will gather, and the mask will rise anew." He looked up, eyes gleaming. "Watson, Rathbone's ambitions weren't confined to a single performance. He had co-conspirators, perhaps an entire society, devoted to continuing Reinhardt's research. They intend to unleash the full version of the Velvet Mask on the public under cover of a performance." I felt the blood drain from my face. But Covent Garden? That's the Royal Opera. A full house. Hundreds of attendees. Holmes nodded grimly. "A perfect test audience." He tucked the document into his coat. "We have 3 days. We must prepare." Back at Baker Street, dawn was beginning to ghost the windows as Holmes assembled his notes, diagrams, and the remaining pages of Reinhardt's manuscript. He outlined a 3-pronged plan, one requiring Inspector Lestrade, Eleanor Reinhardt, and a specially modified orchestral score. I stood over his shoulder, amazed as always by his precision under pressure. "You mean to let them go through with the performance?" He turned to me. "Only in part. We allow the overture to proceed long enough for the conspirators to reveal themselves. Then, at the climax, Eleanor performs the true counterpoint. The moment the velvet mask asserts its hold, we break it. And if she fails?" Holmes lit his pipe, the flame briefly illuminating the resolve in his eyes. "She won't. The final note has been written, Watson. We simply need to ensure it is heard." He looked out the window toward the waking city, the spires and chimneys of London silhouetted against the soft light. "In the theater of human minds," he said softly, "it is the unseen conductor who shapes the performance. Let us ensure that conductor serves reason, not illusion." With that, we readied ourselves for the final Act 1, in which truth and deception would face each other on the grandest of stages, and where Holmes, as ever, would orchestrate the outcome from the shadows. Final section, the counterpoint of truth and night of the performance, arrived with the heavy air of anticipation that usually heralded only the grandest events in London's musical season. Covent Garden Opera House glowed beneath its gaslights, the colonnaded entrance bristling with hansoms, their occupants disgorging in silk, velvet, and furs. Unbeknownst to the audience, however, they were not merely patrons of music that night. They were to become unwitting participants in an experiment decades in the making. Holmes and I had taken our positions early. He disguised as a retired conductor from Prague, his beard and thick spectacles rendering him unrecognizable. I was placed among the upper tiers as a roving physician, supposedly tending to an aging baroness with a fainting tendency. Lestrade and 3 trusted men were disguised as ushers. Scattered through the grand circle dot at center stage, Eleanor Reinhardt waited in the wings, dressed in black, her hair pulled tightly beneath a lace veil. She clutched the restored score to her chest, the velvet mask as her late husband had first composed it. The orchestral pit, meanwhile, prepared to play the version that Rathbone and his conspirators had amended, laced with harmonic structures believed to influence memory, cognition, and mood. The velvet curtain rose at precisely 8 o'clock. The first movement flowed with ease, its beauty undeniable, its complexity challenging even to the most seasoned ear. But Holmes and I knew better. Beneath its elegance lay a subtle manipulation, patterns within patterns, shifting tonal centers, intervals of minor sixths designed to evoke feelings of longing, dependency, and passivity as the music intensified. So too did the atmosphere. Several audience members leaned forward, visibly entranced. Others had closed their eyes. A low murmur passed between them. The spell had begun. Holmes rose from his seat, and I did the same, both moving toward the wings. Eleanor appeared ready, her cue approaching. She nodded to Holmes once. It was time. With elegant precision, she stepped onto the stage as the orchestra swelled into the masked theme. But rather than yielding to the expected motif, she raised her bow and played Dot, the counterpoint. Not merely notes, but a disruptive element. Musical antidote composed by Reinhardt himself before his death and kept from Rathbone. A sharp, crystalline strand of sound ran counter to the dominant theme, breaking its hold. The hall shuddered with the clash of intentions. Eleanor played with conviction, her eyes locked upon the audience. A woman in the front row gasped. A gentleman dropped his opera glasses. Someone else began to sob, then laugh, then fall silent altogether. The spell was unraveling. Dot in the box above the orchestra. A movement, then a flash of silver. Holmes darted past me and surged up the side staircase. A man cloaked in a gray coat and high collar had risen from the shadows and aimed a small object. Modified tuning fork, no doubt, to resonate with the manipulated tones. But Holmes was faster. A crash, a scuffle, and the figure collapsed to the ground as Lestrade's men swarmed him. Holmes retrieved a device, studied it, and shook his head. Clever, but ultimately crude. I joined him as the final chords rang out, Eleanor lowering her violin as the orchestra fell still. A thunderous silence engulfed the opera house, followed by an ovation, a thunderous, reverent response from an audience who had no idea how close they'd come to mental manipulation. In the aftermath, we learned the man Holmes had tackled was Professor Miles Devane, Rathbone's closest collaborator. He had been dismissed from the conservatory some years prior for unorthodox experimentation, but had continued Rathbone's work in secret, funding a hidden circle of musical theorists devoted to weaponizing harmony. The documents we uncovered, from Devane's flat, revealed plans for similar performances in Vienna and St. Petersburg, as well as a proposed symphonic induction system for use in military training. Holmes ensured the notes and devices were destroyed. The ministry was informed in the vaguest of terms, and the public was told only that a minor on-stage mishap had briefly disrupted the performance. As for Eleanor, she disappeared once more, not into obscurity, but into quiet freedom. The Reinhardt violin was returned to her, and the original velvet mask was sealed within the British Museum's vaults, under Holmes' recommendation. That night, back at Baker Street, we sat before the fire, Holmes with his pipe, I with pen and journal in hand. You said once that music was the most abstract form of communication, I remarked, and yet tonight it became the most dangerous. Holmes exhaled a slow stream of smoke. It was never the music, Watson. It was the intent behind it. Sound can soothe or shatter. Art is never neutral when wielded as a weapon. He rose and crossed to the window, gazing down at the lamplit streets. Rathbone and Devane sought control, but Eleanor gave the world something greater. Not obedience, but understanding. He turned and gave a rare smile. You see, Watson, true counterpoint is not about dominance. It's about balance. A second voice rising to meet the first, not to overpower it, but to complete it. With that, he picked up his violin the one instrument he trusted beyond all others, and played a single phrase. It was neither from the velvet mask nor any known concerto dot. It was his own, a soft, unfinished melody drifting through the room like a final question, an invitation, perhaps, to believe that even amidst deception, the truth can still be heard. Closed my journal then, knowing that what had happened would never be fully told. And yet, I closed my journal then, knowing that what had happened would never be fully told. And yet, as with so many cases before, the music of that night would echo in my mind for years to come. The secret behind the velvet mask had been revealed, and Sherlock Holmes once again had faced the shadows and brought us back to the light.